When the city renamed the old Suryamas Hospital a restricted site, most people forgot it existed. Ivy climbed its windows like slow green flames, and the main gate rusted shut. But I remembered it. I remembered the night 10 years ago when my grandmother had been wheeled through those doors, a white sheet tucked at her feet, her hand squeezing mine with a strength that felt borrowed from elsewhere. She recovered, briefly, and then slipped away after the hospital closed. I remembered the smell of antiseptic and rain. I remembered a whisper I could never place, like someone rehearsing a prayer just beneath hearing. I didn't intend to return. Life moved on. I studied sound design, learned how rooms carry echoes and how stairs swallow certain frequencies. When the city archive advertised a paid digitization project for historical audio, I saw an address attached to a box of abandoned tapes. Suryamas Hospital, North Wing. The old interest reopened like a drawer. Careful, stiff, but still working. The key came wrapped in brown paper. It was small and plain, with a stamped number, 17. No instructions. Only a typed note, return what you borrow. I stood at the main gate with my backpack, recorder, spare batteries, headlamp, gloves, and felt the city shrink behind me. The fence gave way to an untrimmed courtyard, bits of glass glittering like sleepy eyes. The front doors, though chained, had a gap wide enough for a determined shoulder. Inside, dust, daylight in narrow stripes, and a chill that seemed to think before it moved. The lobby smelled faintly of paper and something metallic that wasn't quite blood. More like old coins and weathered pipes. I clicked on my headlamp, testing my recorder. Levels fine, ambient presence gentle, floorboards relatively quiet. A signboard still listed departments in fading paint. Pediatrics, cardiology, respiratory, North Wing, records and audio. North Wing. It was down a corridor where the daylight strained and thinned. My headlamp found peeling wallpaper beneath a row of framed photographs. A ribbon cutting. Smiling nurses. A man with silver hair adjusting a microphone. Under each photo, the captions had curled away from their glue. The hospital was speaking in a language of slow collapse. A draft wafted from the North Wing and brought the faintest murmur. Not the kind that says words, but the kind that assures you the building is not empty after all. My recorder caught it and returned it to me on the headphones. A soft hush, like a choir far away, or wind through a cluster of soft pages. I paused the recording and took the headphones off. The murmur went with them. Without the gear, there was only the stillness, a pleasant, careful stillness. Room 17 was at the end of the corridor, the number painted in a milky square. The key turned smoothly, as if used yesterday. Inside, a small archive, metal shelves, a desk with a stubborn drawer, 2 reel-to-reel players covered by transparent plastic that had yellowed with time. Boxes of tapes, each labeled with neat dates. The newest label was from a decade ago, the year the hospital closed. I was there to digitize, yes, but curiosity adjusted the contract in my head. I wanted to listen first. I slid on cotton gloves, chose a tape labeled Night Rounds, ambient, and carefully threaded it, the way my professor had taught us with the patience of a watchmaker. The reels turned. The speakers warmed. Then the room changed. What came through was not only footsteps. It was a shape of walking, a measured, kind rhythm, like someone who checks to see whether the corridor is asleep before they continue. A voice hummed a melody without words, something close to a lullaby. The footsteps paused, resumed. My headlamp reflected off the plastic player cover and briefly created the outline of a person across the opposite wall. A trick of light, nothing more. The lullaby faded, replaced by a hush, a barely there shift of air. A whisper slid along the floor, rose up the metal shelves, and found my ear. It was not aggressive, not even sad. It sounded like someone testing a secret in a language made mostly of breath. "Hello?" I asked, feeling foolish. The recorder on my shoulder blinked its small red light, calm as a heartbeat. The tape clicked. A second voice joined, quiet as paper folding. "Is anyone awake?" The reel stuttered. The building settled. And then the whisper came again, not from the speaker, not from memory, but from the doorway behind me, a sound that belonged to a person who wasn't there. Is anyone awake? I turned, fast, knocking my elbow into the desk. The corridor was empty, pale, patient. But something had changed, as if the hospital had drawn a breath it hadn't taken in years and was now wondering what to do with the oxygen. I stopped the tape. The whisper stopped. The silence felt polite, waiting for my decision. Just a digitization project, I told the room. I'll return what I borrow. I rewound the tape, labeled it in my notes, and tried a second. Operating theater, mic test. When the reel spun, the lights in the corridor flickered in the way old buildings do, as if remembering electricity. On the recording, nothing dramatic, just the gentle hum of fluorescent lights, a technician's voice testing. 1 2 1 2. And then the same lullaby farther away, a little shy. My grandmother had hummed that once, when the rain tossed its beads against the glass. She had said it was older than she was, older than the ward. She said hospitals, like people, remember songs. I pressed stop. The day outside was losing color. My headlamp gained it. I decided to pack up and come back tomorrow with a fresh plan, a longer extension cord, and less nervousness. I locked room 17, pocketed the key, and walked back through the corridor. The photographs shone in my lamp like old coins. At the lobby, I paused. Without the headphones, the building felt purely vacant. But as I pushed through the chain doors and slipped back into the courtyard, the recorder on my shoulder kept running, just long enough to capture a final small shape of sound, a whisper riding the hinge of the world between inside and outside. Good night, it said, like a habit learned from kindness. I answered without thinking. Good night. The city air felt warmer, and the ivy sighed in a breeze. Above me, windows watched with the quiet curiosity of rooms that had once been full. I didn't see anything unusual. Yet as I reached the street and looked back, the building's darkness seemed less like absence and more like a gaze, alert and gentle, as if it had decided to remember me. The next afternoon, I returned with better gear and a little resolve. I'd slept lightly, not from fear, but from a feeling of being expected. The city was busy with its errands and traffic. Birds nested in stoplights, and delivery bikes made their own gentle weather. At Suriyama's, time felt slower, deliberate. I unlocked the chain, moved through the narrow door gap, and breathed in the elegant old hush. On my way to room 17, I noticed a corkboard I'd missed yesterday. Staff notices. Most papers had fallen, but one remained pinned, brittle and yellowed, a schedule for night rounds. A single name was circled in blue. Nurse Amara. Next to it, a set of guidelines, practical and kind. Before lights out, check blankets. After midnight, soft voices only. Before dawn, hum if a patient wakes. Hum if a patient wakes. In room 17, I set up a small workstation. Player, laptop for digitization, secondary recorder, and a tiny speaker so I could monitor without headphones. The room seemed pleased with the arrangement, the dust behaving like confetti that had decided to retire. I chose a tape labeled Nurse Station, 12 to 4 o'clock. The reel spun. Static crackled politely. Then the sound of cups being placed on a counter, a clock tapping each second into existence, and the hush of sleeping wards behind closed doors. A voice entered, low, clear, with the careful diction of someone aware that even vowels can wake the world. Nurse Amara, Station B. Midnight check complete. Her tone carried warmth without decoration, the way winter sunlight sits gently on a table. Papers rustled. A patient bell chimed faintly, not a cry, more like a question. The tape captured footsteps, Amara's, too smooth to be hurried, too attentive to be slow. I felt the room straighten a little, as if the name itself was posture. On the tape, Amara reached a door, paused, and hummed the lullaby. The melody carried along the corridor like a small lantern. A child's voice whispered something I couldn't make out. Amara answered with a smile tangible in her syllables. Back to dreams, she said. We'll keep watch. A soft click. Lights adjusted on a dimmer. I could feel the hospital as it had been. Warm lamps, blankets tucked, The night held like a fragile thing you carry with two hands. The tape continued. At 1 a.m., a brief phone call, Amara reporting temperatures and notes. At 2 a.m., a kettle. At 3 a.m., rain, tapping gentle interference across the roof. Then a different whisper, one without words, like a draft that found a story. It crept along the baseboards and rode the edges of the reel. Amara's humming grew slightly louder, as if she were guiding the night away from an anxious corner. "It's just the building, sweetheart," she said to someone. The word sweetheart making room for a person I could not see. "It keeps all our voices for later." I paused the tape and sat back. The room stirred. The corridor listened. The idea was both beautiful and unsettling. A hospital saving voices the way a field stores rain. I ejected the reel, labeled the segment on my laptop, then loaded another. Emergency generator. Test. The tape caught technicians speaking about power loads and backup reserves. Voices full of mild pride. In the background, invisible to them, the same whisper threaded the space, like belief or habit. At some point I realized I wasn't alone in room 17. This wasn't a sudden dread, but a slow comprehension, as when you realize a second hand has been moving the whole time. I looked up to find the doorway empty yet aware, like an ear turned toward music. "Amara," I asked, barely above a breath. "If you're here, thank you for the lullaby." A sound answered from the corridor. Not a word. A shape. A reply made of patience. I adjusted the gain on my recorder, set it to capture both the tapes and the room. The levels rose. The nothingness became a textured fabric of small rustles and shy notes. In that woven quiet, I heard something like a sigh, and then the barest hint of a voice, carried as if by habit more than force. "Is anyone awake?" I kept my hands still to keep the room's trust. "I am," I said. "I'm just borrowing." Silence becomes a conversation if you hold it long enough. The corridor released some of its distance. I turned back to the tapes, to a reel labeled Final Night, North Wing. The date matched the hospital's last day. The tape was short, no more than 15 minutes, and began with rain. Heavy, steady, kind rain, the sort that tucks everything under a soft drum of order. A technician spoke into the mic, archiving ambient. Nurse Amara on rounds. Her humming came through, closer than before, like a mother at the edge of sleep. Then the generator test, and a polite alarm because machines like to announce themselves. Then a window opened, perhaps to show the rain to someone who believed it was healing. Then the whisper again, familiar and not, layered now, like two voices in one room. The technician said, half laughing, "The hospital talks." Amara answered, "We all do, when we've held enough nights." A pause. A thump, as of a door caught by wind. The lullaby again, with a smile behind it. And then, the tape ended. Not a harsh cut, a gentle, tidy stop, like a closing hand. I waited for more. There was none. I labeled the file Final Night, complete, and sat still. In the doorway, air gathered itself, considering whether to move forward. The building seemed at once relieved and shy, as if something long carried had been set down, but not forgotten. "Tomorrow," I told room 17. "I'll bring new spindles, fresh sleeves. We'll put the voices someplace they can't fade." Outside, the afternoon thinned toward evening. The hospital, in its graceful disrepair, exhaled a breath I could hear on the recording. A soft sound, neither a word nor a warning. More like a promise held for the night. "We'll keep watch." The third day I arrived early and brought a thermos. Morning light made lace of the lobby dust. I felt welcome, an unusual adjective for a vacant building, but the only one that fit. On a table behind reception, I found an old guest ledger left open to a page marked by a ribbon. No names, only a column labeled time in and a blank for time out. Certain entries showed the same peculiar gap. People who had come during ordinary hours but never wrote their exit time. It didn't feel sinister, more like people who had left without ceremony, trusting the building to understand. I checked my notes. Between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. on several tapes, A thin band of audio went strange. Not silent. Not noisy. Strange. Frequencies narrowed. The room sounded like a photograph. Still, lovely, withholding. Sound techs call these dead minutes, often the result of cables or power. But the hospital had perfect power then, the generator faithful. The nurse's steps resumed at 3:01 as if nothing had paused. I threaded a reel labeled Ward B, Night Watch, hunting the hour. At 1:58 a.m., footsteps. At 1:59 a.m., a bell politely asking a question. At 2 a.m., the world became thin as paper. The tape still moved. The machine still hummed. But the room on the tape withdrew, like a person stepping behind a curtain. I heard a faint syllable hidden in the thinnest part of the sound. Not help, not stay, more like the inhale before a yes. Outside of the tape, in present time, the corridor grew attentive, the way a dog tilts its head when you say a familiar word. I turned the monitoring up, knowing that more gain often brings more ghosts of electricity than truth. Yet what filled the headphones was not electrical. It was presence-changing state, not vanishing, but moving sideways into a place that speakers were never designed to show. At 3:01 a.m. on the reel, a teacup set down on a tray. Amara's voice, simple. All right. The ward sighed. The night resumed. What happens in that hour? I asked nobody, and perhaps everybody. The building listened to the question like a friend. A breath moved along the corridor, not chilly, but cool in that careful way certain rooms look after quilts in the winter. I heard the lullaby with no source, not from the tape, not from behind me, but as if the walls were humming to themselves. I pulled out a small binaural microphone pair and clipped them to the shelf to capture the room as a head might hear it. I set the recorder to run for hours if necessary. If the hospital had something to show, I wanted to honor the pace. With the microphones listening, I explored. The pediatrics door opened to soft colors faded into gentler shades. A mural of animals in loose watercolor grinned at the wrong angle of time. Drawers held paper cranes, comic books, a pack of crayons whose paper sleeves had curled. At the end of the ward, a small playroom overlooked the courtyard. The glass was smudged with old handprints, like fog fixed into memory. Beneath the window, a wooden box for lost items. Inside, a child's scarf and an old pager. The pager surprised me. When I turned it over, a name engraved into the plastic. Amara. The battery had long since retired, yet the device held the dignity of tools that had helped. I carried it back to room 17, placed it on the desk, and felt the air reorganize itself in a grateful way. The tape reached 2 a.m. again as I scrubbed back and forth to understand the frequency drop. Then the pager on the desk made a sound no dead plastic should make, a tiny click, like a throat clearing politely. I looked at it. It looked exactly like a pager does when it refuses to perform. But the room approved. The corridor paused. A whisper walked across the floor, not a step, more a careful choice. Is anyone awake? The voice was almost not a voice at all, too quiet to insist, too present to ignore. I am, I said. What happens at 2? I listened with the softest part of my attention, the place where we notice when someone is about to knock. The whisper that answered wasn't a sentence, it was a set of directions, the sense of someone pointing gently toward the stairs we never use. I packed the recorder under my arm and followed the indication toward a service staircase behind radiology, the kind that barely belongs to a building, meant more for maintenance than humans. Dust made the steps uncertain. The banister smiled slivers into my gloves. At the bottom, a door. Chapel. The handle turned. Inside, simple benches, a window with stained glass that had turned honey-colored with age, and a small table. Not religious symbols exactly. More like a place designed for pauses. The air smelled faintly of eucalyptus and paper. On the table lay a ledger different from the guest book upstairs. This one was for messages. Most were small. Thank you for today. Please let the tests be kind. We'll try again tomorrow. In neat, brushed ink, a note was written on the last page. Between 2 and 3, We hold our breath with you. No signature. The ink had faded to a kind brown. I carried the page in my memory back to room 17, where the open microphones had been listening to an ordinary afternoon. When I reviewed the recording, I found in the middle an unexpected lullaby, recorded while I was away. It floated in like a bird unsure whether the window was open. I would have missed it without the trust built by being present. This is what we'll do, I told the room. We'll set up a proper watch tonight. 2 to 3. If you keep your breath, I'll keep mine. We'll listen together. The pager clicked once more, like an agreement. I came at midnight, the city behind me a glittering equation solved by lights. I brewed tea in the lobby with a camping stove, the scent of jasmine making light of the long corridors. I placed a cup on the receptionist's desk out of a private sense of manners, a way of saying I see you to the ghost of a job still worthy of courtesy. In room 17, I arranged the equipment like a ritual. 2 reel machines ready to spin blank archival stock, not to play tapes but to accept a live feed, the idea being symbolic, but symbols matter in buildings that keep stories. My digital recorders armed with 4 microphones. 2 in the corridor, 1 in the chapel, 1 by the pediatrics window. The old pager on the desk, a small paperweight of a name. At 1:55 a.m., the hospital grew more itself. Spaces tightened into attention without becoming hard. The temperature eased lower in a way that felt respectful, like a theater as the overture begins. I wrote a single line in my notebook. Between 2 and 3, we hold our breath with you. At 2 a.m., the world thinned, yes, but not into fear. It thinned into a hallway where sound walked in slippers. The microphones registered a gentle mute of high frequencies, like a soft curtain drawn across a bright window. The chapel mic picked up the faintest airflow, a thoughtful breeze shifting pages of the ledger as if someone had leaned to read. The corridor mics caught footsteps without weight, a rhythm reminiscent of Amara's, efficient, kind, exact. I whispered, so as not to break the shape of the hour. If anyone is awake, I'm listening. Silence answered, acceptable, decent silence, the kind that holds a hand. Then the lullaby, nearer than ever, followed immediately by something I had not expected. Dozens of tiny breaths, layered like a field of sleeping wheat. Not the ragged air of fear. The air of people being watched over. I was not alone in this hour. I was simply a late addition to a vigil that had been held every night that walls exist. I thought of my grandmother, her fingers around mine, the rain making a roof of sound. I thought of nurses flattening sheets with a grace that refuses attention. I thought of technicians who kept the world humming even when no one wrote songs about them. The lullaby drew closer, gentled by a smile I couldn't see but completely trusted. The pager on the desk clicked. Then again, a small metronome. On the corridor mics, Amara's voice, or the kindness that remembered her. Back to dreams, it said. We'll keep watch. Footsteps marked around. On the pediatrics mic, something like giggles in sleep, but not audible so much as imaginable, suggested to the mind, accepted by the heart. I stood without standing, if that makes sense. I didn't want to break the hour's surface. The equipment did the moving that I could not. The reels spun, silent, blank, but not empty, because sometimes turning itself is a prayer. The digital recorders captured traces that meters barely recognized. The building, pleased with itself, held the breath of everyone who had ever needed the night to be kind. At 2:40, a gentle change. Rain touched the roof, not in weather but in memory, as if the building had decided to remember the exact sound that kept a child calm in 2008. The chapel mic recorded the soft sound of a bench acknowledging new weight. I knew without knowing that someone sat down beside me, a presence made of attention. Is anyone awake? Came the ritual question, not for information but for connection. I am, I answered, and if my voice wavered, it was not from fear. I am. At 2:59, a steadying. The frequencies returned like a hand opening. The pager clicked and then went quiet. The chapel page turned itself to a new leaf. The lullaby became only the quiet after song. The hour exhaled. At 3:01, room 17 was a room again. My tea had cooled. My hands were warm. The recordings had captured, not proof, exactly, and not tricks, but traces. Presence arranged into sound, intention organized into the language of quiet. I saved everything, duplicated it, labeled it in the careful script archivists use when they know labels are also gestures of love. Then I spoke to an empty doorway that was not empty. "Thank you," I said. "We'll return what we borrow." From the corridor, a sound like a smile. Morning came like a small apology for how brilliant it can be. I brewed new tea and left one in the chapel out of gratitude. I spent the day in room 17 transferring the overnight recordings. Slow work that suits a mind both occupied and quiet. While the progress bars moved, always slower when watched, I wrote a letter and left it on the desk. To whoever hums. To Nurse Amara. To the building that keeps watch. Thank you. I will bring these voices to a place where they will be treated with care. I will not sell them or make a spectacle. I will archive them as you archived us. Between 2 and 3, I will remember to breathe gently. A listener. I made additional copies on drives with labels printed cleanly, placed them in padded envelopes, and addressed one to the city archive, one to the small historical society, and one to a community center that runs a listening room. I kept one for myself. Not to hoard, but so I could return here with something in my hand if the building ever asked to hear itself. Before I left, I walked the hospital the way a person walks a house they are moving out of. Grateful, attentive, pausing to thank corners. In pediatrics, I placed the scarf back into the lost and found box. In the staff hallway, I pinned a fresh sheet to the corkboard. Night rounds. We remember. In the chapel, I wrote a final note in the ledger. We heard you. Thank you for hearing us. Back in the lobby, I hesitated. The chain on the front doors shone in a beam of sun, and the city beyond felt a touch louder than usual. I slipped through the gap, careful of the hinge that said goodnight. On the sidewalk, I turned and raised my hand the way we do when we wave at someone who may or may not be at the window. That night at home, I listened to the recordings with the patient light of my desk lamp. The hour between 2 and 3 remained its beautiful narrowness, the lullaby its little lamp, the breaths their field of wheat. But in the middle of one file, barely a brushstroke, only a suggestion, I heard my own voice answer, "I am from inside the building." It wasn't an echo, it was a placement. The hospital, gently adding me to its store of breaths and cathedrals of kindness. Weeks passed. The city archive emailed to say the recordings had been received with gratitude and were being prepared for public listening, with context and care. The Historical Society invited me to give a talk titled, "Hospitals Remember Songs." The community center asked for permission to play the lullaby softly in their waiting room, to remind people that nights have guardians. One evening, while washing dishes, I caught a melody under the noise of the faucet. I turned the tap off, and the melody kept on. It wasn't coming from a speaker or a hallway. It was coming from the simple business of a house being a house. Pipes settling, the refrigerator's friendly hum, the street's gentle argument with itself. It was the lullaby, and it came with a memory of a hand that had once squeezed mine with great borrowed strength. I returned to Suriyama's only once after that, to slide the key for room 17 beneath the door with a note. Returned. The hospital did not protest. It did not slam or rattle. It simply allowed the sound of the envelope to be filed into its system of soft approvals. At the gate, I heard the quiet question I had come to love. Is anyone awake? I smiled in the broad, ordinary daylight. We are, I said. We are. The wind touched the ivy. Windows held their positions like dignified elders at a garden party. Somewhere in the building, an old pager clicked for the last time, or for the next, or perhaps that was only the way leaves applaud. I walked away with no need to look back. The hospital would manage, as it always had, as we all try to. And if anyone ever asked what we found in the hour between 2 and 3, I would not say ghosts. I would say, a promise kept in quiet hands. I would say, people remembering people. I would say, a building that learned to hum because hums are the shape of care when words are too heavy. The city, full of errands and traffic and birds shaping their nests out of today's weather, made a sound like moving on. I matched my steps to it. And somewhere, in the layered library of all the rooms that have ever watched over us, a lullaby went on, as it does, humble and steady, making of silence a good night.